When did unemployment rates of 9.5% or 10% in the United States become, as they seem to have become, acceptable?
Well, I think after they stayed there for a little while. It's kind of remarkable how we get used to these things. In the Great Depression, people got used to much higher rates of unemployment. 1981 recession, 8% became sort of the new normal then for a while. 1990s, the economy roared along, and 4% became the new normal. So I think you can get used to these things reasonably quickly. I think what's maybe a little different now in terms of whether this is really acceptable depends entirely on who you ask. But I think one of the things going on now is there's a much sharper divide in terms of what we think might be done about it. So there's a larger group of more vocal folks now who think that there is nothing to be done about the current unemployment rate, that we just have to wait for the economy to work itself out, and that there's particularly nothing the government could or should or ought to do. And I think that contributes maybe more and faster to this idea that it's normal and acceptable.
Is there something different about who's being affected this time? It's always been workers in the lower paying income brackets who were affected the most. But there's some statistics, I think, that show that slant is even stronger this time. And do you agree with that? And what's the cause of that? And if so, what could be done about it?
I think if we roll back the clock, after World War II, layoffs were concentrated almost entirely on younger workers and almost completely on production workers. So if you had a white-collar job, you never lost your job because of ups and downs in the economy. And if you had a production job, you were in a unionized operation or you're in one that copied the union practices, the least senior people got laid off first. So that began to change in 1981. We started to see many more white-collar layoffs and also increasingly layoffs of more experienced workers. I'd say what's different this time around is that, between 1981 and now, we had a pretty moderate economic environment. Recessions that we had were pretty modest and pretty mild. So I think what's going on now is the same sort of thing that went on in 1981, and that is lots of white-collar workers getting hit, and particularly older workers with more seniority getting hit, I think in part because they're more expensive, in part because, and I'm not sure this is right, a lot of employers think that younger workers would be better value in terms of, replacements. So I think what's a little different now is it looks like men are being hit more, and that's because the service jobs are disproportionately women and employ women, and those jobs have been a little less hit than the manufacturing production sort of jobs, which are disproportionately men. I think that's the big change. I'd say otherwise this recession just looks a little more like 1981 and not like the milder recessions we had in between when layoffs were not such a big deal.
The period of time that people are being out of work for has increased quite a bit. Long-term unemployed now account for 46% of total unemployed, which is up from 28% just a year ago. So the longer these folks are out, the rustier their skills become, the more difficult it becomes to wedge themselves back into the workforce, especially if they're older. What are the implications of that kind of dynamic, which I don't think we've seen before?
Well, I think, again, this is what you see in deeper recessions, and I think it's particularly a consequence of structural changes. If this was just an old-fashioned inventory-driven recession where the economy wears down its inventories and then comes back up, it wouldn't be such a big deal, wouldn't hit so many people, wouldn't hit so deeply. People wouldn't be laid off so long. I think what we're starting to see now, with maybe a more global economy, is that certain sectors go down and stay down. The jobs go overseas, the business goes to competitors elsewhere, especially in manufacturing. So those jobs never come back. And that's a trend that's been underway since about 1981. And, the consequence of that is really horrific, right, in the sense that it's hard for people to retrain later in life. It's hard to get the skills to retrain. You're competing with people who are 22 and don't need a lot of money and sometimes are looking for jobs simply to get experience. You see an incredible explosion now in internships and voluntary internships where people basically work for nothing. Often this is actually against the law. It violates the Fair Labor Standards Act to hire people or to have people do productive work and not pay them. But this is pretty widespread, and people are doing that just to get experience. And if you're somebody, let's say, who's been a production worker all your life and you're trying to be retrained for a service job, let's assume the jobs actually were there. You're competing against people who are, much younger and don't need as much money, who are perhaps better plugged into career management services and things. It's really quite difficult. And that, doesn't even account for the fact that people who have been out of school for 20 years or so, to go back to school and to learn a completely different skill set can be quite a difficult thing to do. So this is quite devastating. Some of these folks who lost their jobs now, frankly, will never get their jobs back. When I say that, they will certainly not get their current job back. They're unlikely to get any job that's related to the one that they were laid off from back. And so the step down is quite extraordinary. If you were like an investment banker or something, and you think about what's the next best use of your skills if you can't get employed in that arena anymore, it's not completely obvious what the next step down is for you. And for a lot of those folks, it's way down.
Just to back up a little bit, we were talking about policy differences and whether the government should do anything or we just wait for the economy to spontaneously recover. Is there any way to square that circle? Are there any kind of policy decisions that might be acceptable to both sides? Perhaps it's tax credits for hiring people. Maybe you have some other suggestions.
Well, I think the dynamic at the moment is the rise of a kind of anti-government dimension to the politics. Certainly this has always been part of American policy debates, but it seems to be stronger now. And these arguments basically say that deficit spending doesn't work. They basically say that government spending per se won't stimulate the economy. And some of these positions are frankly just, as the extent to which we know about these things, simply wrong. For example, the idea that extending unemployment benefits is bad for the economy. Some of the arguments are these folks, if you give them unemployment insurance, they won't take jobs. Well, there's certainly something to that, but the problem right now is there are no jobs to be had, so it's not like you're preventing these people from getting paid employment. And in terms of stimulating the economy, that's a great way to stimulate the economy because those folks spend virtually every penny that they get in unemployment benefits. But, there are folks who have influence on the political spectrum who just don't accept that position, don't even believe that stimulating the economy is a useful thing to do. So there's not a lot of middle ground there. I think, the idea of demand-led expansions, that is, give employers more benefits, more tax credits, that sort of thing, to hire. I think the problem with that, it sounds good to the pro-business community, but when you start thinking about it carefully, it's quite a difficult thing to pull off. How do you know, for example, that a new hire has really come about because of the tax policy, the tax changes? We're just getting people who would have been hired anyway who are claiming the tax credits. It's very difficult to police that sort of thing. The possibilities for fraud are actually much bigger than they are, I think, for unemployment insurance. So I think part of the problem with things which are politically acceptable, particularly to the sort of anti-government view, is that the more evidence-based view finds most of those things unpalatable and that they don't actually work very well. So there's almost no common ground between what the sort of pro-government folks would find acceptable and what the anti-government folks would find unacceptable. In terms of cutting more taxes is always popular with the anti-government folks, but at the moment, the budget deficit lobbies find that unpalatable. So there's just not a lot of common ground.
So it sounds like gridlock. If it wasn't so tight of a standoff, what kind of policies might work in a way that maybe didn't, run the deficit up so much that they become self-defeating?
Well, I think at the moment, the sense about why the economy is not doing better is something that we don't have a great answer to, because we don't have a lot of experience with situations like this. The prevailing view was that after 1981, we had sort of figured out how to manage recessions better. There's a pushback on that argument now, and the pushback is to suggest that what really changed was not that we got better at managing the economy. What really changed was that companies internally got better at managing their inventories. And the idea of an inventory-led recession, where companies just build up these stocks of inventories, they got too much sitting around, they don't buy anymore, and then the economy goes down. That idea more or less went away because these just-in-time inventory systems mean you don't build up piles of inventory. So I'd say the first issue is we don't have a good sense of what's going on right now with respect to how to improve the economy. I think there is a sense that, from historical research that things like unemployment insurance payments do help. They stimulate the economy. I think the problem right now, certainly my read of the problem, is that the problem is still in the financial sector, and it has to do with banks and their willingness to make loans. Interest rates are at record low levels, but people who are looking for a house, for example, find it extraordinarily difficult to get a mortgage. If you get one, you can get it at a great rate, but the banks are so concerned about defaults now that it's very difficult to qualify for a mortgage. So credit is tight is the problem, despite the fact that monetary policy has made interest rates quite low. And we don't actually know how to solve that problem without getting deep into the manipulation of the banks themselves. And that probably goes beyond what even the pro-government folks would see as acceptable at the moment, or at least know how to traverse it. So it's a bit of uncharted water, how to make the banks loan or even encourage the banks to loan. Pretty tricky undertaking right now.
A little closer to home, how is this environment affecting MBA graduates, such as those from Wharton?
Well, I'd say, for our students, it has not been as bad, frankly, for two reasons. One is a historical reason, in that because they're seen as being, in some ways, at the top of the pool, when jobs are available, our folks would be the ones to get them, and people having a tougher time are the people further down the pecking order. But I think that the companies that traditionally hire our students, the investment banks and the consulting firms especially, who hire big waves of MBAs every year, they made some strategic decisions a few years ago to make sure that they didn't get stuck with a demographic imbalance. So in the 2001 recession, for example, a lot of companies, consulting firms, stopped hiring. And then they discovered 3 years later that they had no employees with 3 years of experience. And their business model is that the third years teach the first years what to do, and then the fifth years teach the third years what to do. And they discovered they had no third-year people anymore. They didn't hire 2 years before. So I think the bad news is they decided to lay off more people in the downturn than they probably needed to in order to make sure that they could come back even in the downturn and hire some people to be first-year associates to smooth out their demographics. So I'd say this is, in some ways, has been a redistribution of the burden from the new hires to the more experienced workers. You see this in law firms to some extent, too. The people who are in the worst shape often were people with 3 to 5 years experience suddenly got laid off. Some of the better students from the better schools graduating found it easier to get jobs.
Thanks very much for chatting with us today.
My pleasure.